My name is Doug Haag. I was born in Two Rivers in 1932, June 27th, 1932. I was actually born in what was then referred to as the Bates House. Conrad Bate, I think his name was the editor of the paper, in addition to some other high-profile things in the city. And that house is still standing, and it's down near the Jefferson, or the 17th Street Bridge, which is now a marina, I think. But at that time, my mom and dad lived in the upstairs flat, and Dr. Slotnick was called for my birth and came to the upstairs, and he did that often, actually, and many times not expecting, and he was correct about this, not expecting his fee of $25 would ever be paid. But I came into the world at about 9.5 pounds, and my mom only weighed 110, so that was quite an accomplishment. And that house, and we lived there for a little while, that house was near the old, well, we call it Miro now, but at that time it was called the Aluminum Goods Manufacturing Company. And it was located right on the river, and our house was separated from the river by a railroad track, and that track was used for loading and unloading boxcars into the actual plant there. So when the train came by the house, it literally shook our house, sometimes probably keeping baby Doug awake, I'm not sure. But not long after that, we moved to Garfield Street, which was, of course, on the other side of town, right next to, and in fact, it bordered Neshoto Park. And we lived in a lower flat there. And my mom liked that because she could take me in the baby buggy, as they referred to it in those days, and walk every day across the 22nd Street Bridge to her dad's grocery. And that grocery was called Kinzel's, K-U-E-N-Z-E-L-S, Kinzel's Grocery. And it was located kind of where Quick Trip is now. The Pizza Hut is on the corner, and that's where the house was that they rented, and next door was they actually bought a little candy shop from a lady and then turned it into a grocery store. And it was the old-fashioned type of grocery where things were sold in bulk. And times were very tough because it was right after the Depression, if there was an after to it. I think it dragged on for several years, but my dad had trouble keeping a job, and there weren't many to be had to begin with, so it was good that my mom was able to walk over to the grocery store and get some things from her dad. I don't know how they would have made it if it hadn't been for my grandfather, Louis Kenzel, helping her out. And so we enjoyed living there. It was close to the park, so we were able to spend time in the park. And we raised rabbits and chickens and what have you in back of the house on Garfield Street. Of course, that was right near the tennis courts. Now, in those days, not many people played tennis because it was kind of a game that was played by a little wealthier people than we were. And it was interesting because they wore a shirt and tie and cap and knickers and stockings, and they were hardly dressed for playing tennis, but that's how they dressed at that time. So we had a nice, well, certainly a nice place to live, and as I say, it was close to my grandpa's place. My grandfather and grandmother had 4 daughters and 1 son. Well, actually 2 sons. One was, Joseph, was killed in an automobile accident, oddly enough, even in those days when he was a young boy. So it was my mom and her 3 sisters and my uncle Al, or Alfie was his name actually, who helped out in the store. And as years went by, my mother and her sisters, all of whom lived in Manitowoc, were married and lived in Manitowoc, would come to their mom's house or my grandma's house to do their laundry, because my grandmother had an old wringer washer run with a motor, and of course the girls didn't have washing machines, so they came and they did their laundry, and they would help their mom bake things to be sold at the store, and many times pick up the bakery and bread and so on that hadn't sold, so they would get the day-old bakery and other things too to take back to their families.
You had a story about, was it the olives or the pickle barrel?
Yes, well, I'm still talking about when I was in the infant stage or buggy stage, but
Okay.
yeah, that's true. I grew up there, and we then moved, when I was about 6 or 5 or 6, we moved to Manitowoc, where my dad had a used tire and battery store. But again, my mom would take the car, and my brother and I, incidentally, my brother was also born on Garfield Street. He's 3 years younger than I am, and I can remember, I must have been 2.5 or 3, I can remember the Dr. Slotning again, coming to the house with his black bag, and all the hush-hush was going on in the other bedroom where my mom was, and she delivered Roger, my brother Roger. But anyway, after that we did live in Manitowoc in the upstairs flat on Quay Street. Quay Street, it was a little, I say little, it was because it was only 3 blocks long, downtown Manitowoc, and my dad had his shop there. So we would go to grandma's to get food and to do our laundry and so on, and back and forth in a little wooden station wagon kind of truck. And as I got to be probably 8 or 9 years old, I could help my grandpa out in the grocery store. Now the grocery store was certainly not self-service, although there were some things I suppose that were available to reach, but you simply told my grandpa or my aunt or Alphage, my uncle, what you wanted, and they got it for you. And one of the things they did was sell vinegar in a large wooden keg with a spigot on it, and he would make sauerkraut and things like that they sold bulk in the store. We were very poor, as most people were, and so it was a treat to be at the store. And I actually would stay summers at my grandmother's place. They lived on 22nd Street, just a block west of the store. And they had a big, beautiful home, and I always thought it was a mansion. It seemed so huge to me. And I had an opportunity to go through that house a few years ago. It's still there, and it was on the market, so I thought it would be fun to go through it. And many of the cabinets and the tubs with the claw feet were still there. It was kind of fun to see it, although it looked much smaller now than when I was a little kid. So Grandpa would walk back and forth from the store, and we, as I say, I would work with him. I don't think I did much waiting on people. I think I did a few years later. But one of the things that I noticed in the back room were shelves with the food and jars of olives, and I loved olives, but we couldn't afford anything like that. So it occurred to me one day that if I opened up the jar and took maybe 1 olive out of it or 2, it would never be missed because the jar was packed full with olives. And I did that apparently for quite a while, and one day I came in and my grandfather was sitting back there at the big vat or keg of vinegar, and he had the jar of the olive jars open and was pouring vinegar on the top of the fluid that was in there, and I think that was to run the little white specks that had started to form. Once you open a jar of olives and don't refrigerate it, I guess that's what happens. And so he would put the vinegar in it, hoping to get rid of the white sediment, whatever, and then sell it, put it back on the shelves. But I was a little bit frightened, so I didn't stay. And he said, "Douglas, come back here a minute." He said, I said, "What are you doing?" And he told me, and he said, do you like olives? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, well, someone has been opening these jars of olives and tasting them. Do you know anything about that? Yes, grandfather, I do. I did. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. So he said, well, Douglas, you know, our food that we sell to people has to be absolutely perfect, and if it isn't, we're not going to keep our customers. And I think what you did was wrong, and you know it was wrong, but you told me the truth, and I understand. But now we have to hope that we can sell these jars of olives. And I just felt so terrible. And I knew I was going to be punished, or at least I thought I would be punished. But I wasn't. He said, I'll tell you what, you take this jar, and this is yours, and you put it on a shelf somewhere, so only you know where it's at, and that's where you get your olives. But don't you ever, ever tamper with our food again. So, of course, that's one of the things that I'll never forget. And about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my grandfather would say, well, Douglas, you know what time it is? I don't know if it was every day, but it was often. And I'd say, yes, I do know. I'll go get the pail and I'll go across the street and get your beer for you. And I would walk across the street to what was recently called Little Joe's Tavern on Washington Street, across from a Quick Trip. And he'd fill I don't know if I had a dime or a quarter, probably a dime, and he'd fill a little aluminum bucket with a cover on it, and I'd take it back to my grandfather. So he would say, I remember him saying as I was walking across the street, which I'm not sure it was paved, it may have been, probably was, it was Washington Street, but he'd say, now be careful where you step, I just saw the ragman go by with his horse and wagon. So it was very common, of course, to everyone that serviced homes, whether it's the milkman, the scissors and knife sharpening man, the rag man as we call them, or junk man, they all had wagons or carriages pulled by horses. And I was deathly afraid of horses, terribly afraid of horses. And as a 6 or 7 year old, my answer to that was simply lie down, face down on the ground, and cover my head with my arms. And the logic was, if I couldn't see the horse, he couldn't see me, and I would be perfectly safe. And I guess must have worked, because I was never attacked by a horse. Well, the years went by, and grandfather and grandmother had many great times at their house, because people listened to the radio, and Grandpa would come home at noon for lunch, and he would say to my grandmother, well, are we going to eat right away? I want to hear Gabriel Heater. And then some of the as we call them, soapbox stories would come on the air, and they'd listen to those for probably a half hour, an hour, and he'd take his nap, and then back to the store. I'm old enough, could I start today, could I please? He said, yes, you can start when the kids come from high school and they come in the store for candy, but watch them carefully. So that day I was so nervous that I was actually going to wait on people and get the candy and make change and what have you. And this group of probably 5 or 6 or 7 high school kids came in, and they pointed to this and that. The candy was sold bulk in the glass cases, and you were supposed to measure it out and weigh it, and I'm not sure. I was so nervous, I don't even know if I did that. I think I just put it in a bag and gave it to them, and then they gave me money, and I probably gave them incorrect change, or even in one case I remember giving them back more change than they had given me for the candy. And so it was a kind of a new experience for me. But those, and he said to me, he said, I don't like that when these kids come in with their pennies and nickels, because they take more than they buy. And I suppose they were able to do that when he was alone in the store. But there were great memories. People did simple things in those days. Obviously didn't have television, of course we had radio. But my grandparents were very fond of keeping the family together, and they would have, if we had a holiday or even a kind of a family reunion at my grandmother's house, it would be a musical one. Each of the girls played an instrument and sang, and that's how they spent their evening. In fact, when the girls of that family were dating, they were told to bring their dates to the house, and then they would be in the living room or parlor along with, and do the concert, if you want to call it that. And she liked that because Grandma could keep her eye on these dates that the girls had. So there was a lot of that going on. My grandfather was a great singer. He belonged to a group at that time called the Meister Singers, and I think it was made up primarily of German gentlemen, all dressed in tuxes, and we went to many concerts that they did at the high school. After I probably turned maybe 8 years old, I guess, 8 or 9, I was able to take my bicycle and ride it out to what was called Getchin's Grove. And Henry Getchin and his wife owned a farm out there and had cows, and they had access to the river. Their land was on the river, so I would go out there and spend the day and go fishing with them, and I just had a wonderful time. And every morning Henry would deliver fresh eggs and milk to all the grocery stores in town. And I remember helping him unload the glass milk bottles and take back the empties that people returned, and of course bring in the fresh eggs. But that was a wonderful place out at Getchin's Grove. Everybody talked about it. In fact, some of the factories had their factory picnics out there. It was a big, beautiful area, wooded, and big field, right on the river. People could swim and wade in the river. It was a wonderful time. The Mural Company, or the aluminum goods manufacturing company, was a very successful and busy place here in town, as was Hamilton. Hamilton, most people, my grandfather, when he came here from Germany, he got a job as a carpenter, or not a carpenter, but a craftsman in wood, making desks and chairs and things like that. That's what he did. The other thing he did, it was kind of in addition to the grocery store, or maybe it was when they were, when he worked at Hamilton's, he had another job. He had his own business. He knew how to hang wallpaper. In Germany, he learned that trade. And he built a large wooden push cart, I guess, and had his brushes and paste and rolls of wallpaper and that. It was a common thing to see Louis Kenzel pushing his cart up and down the street to go up to various homes and put up wallpaper. And years later, of course, he would do the wallpapering in my aunt's homes. So that was, he was quite an entrepreneur, really, and he was a great carpenter. And I remember vividly, years later, that push cart with the big iron wheels was parked in the backyard, and we would play on it when we were kids. So that was an interesting time of his life, and I think that's really where he put some money aside in order to buy that candy store. Now, when my dad was busy in his shop on Quay Street, and as I said, Quay Street was so unique. We lived upstairs in a flat above this little used tire and used battery store that he ran. And Quay Street ran from 10th Street east down to the car ferry slip, and that was about it. So it was really 3 blocks. And it was a great place to live because right across the street was the Oriental Milling Company right on the river, and they would haul, I think they milled the grain and then put it in train cars. But a beautiful sailing ship named the White Swan delivered the raw grain there, and we would meet the boat, and the men would throw their lines to us, and they'd give us candy. And of course, we thought they came from the other side of the world, I guess, because they came from across Lake Michigan and wherever they picked up the harvested grain. But that living downtown was an unbelievable thing, because that's where all the action was. You could live in a neighborhood and it was not nearly as much fun. In fact, it was so great that my friends from St. Boniface School, which probably was 6 blocks away, really liked to come down to my house to play, because we could play in the stacks of tires that my dad had piled up, and we could play along the tracks. We would take nails and screws and things and lay them on the track, and when the switch engines came slowly over those nails, it flattened them out and made little swords and trinkets and what have you. So that was fun. And another thing that we were able to do is, you know, when they loaded and unloaded the grain, of course a lot of it fell on the ground and in the tracks, so there was a pretty high population of rats that ran around and ate the grain. And my dad and his buddies would sit out on the front porch or the front steps of the shop with their .22s and shoot at the rats, and I always thought that was a great thing. When I grew up, that's what I wanted to do. But Manitowoc, I'll talk a few minutes about that, for me was the greatest place, because nobody knew about Quay Street. I mean, think about it. What kind of a name is Quay Street? It didn't have any pizzazz. I mean, it wasn't like Lincoln Boulevard or Washington Street. It certainly wasn't patriotic. And who really knew what Quay meant anyway? It was just a word. And so my world consisted of 8th Street Bridge south to Quay Street and both sides of 8th Street. As a matter of fact, we had, next to us was a Chinese laundry, and the Chinese people were there with these big vats of steaming water and wooden paddles, and they would stir the clothes and the starch and the water together, and it had a wonderful smell, and they would let us help them. Imagine these little kids, 8, 9 years old, working in that laundry with no rules of any sort. We would take the hot irons that were on the flame and hand it to the pressers. They had men that pressed the shirts after the women washed them, and they were all starched and crisp for the people to pick up. And then going toward 8th Street, which would be east, was a, I guess you'd call it a saloon, a tavern that was so mysterious looking. It was dark and music played, and the men that by this time, this was in 42 when the war started, and we were building submarines. The sailors that came up here to get their submarines would, they had to wait while it was being finished and sea trialed. They would hang out in this tavern, and we'd sit out on the curb, and they'd come out and they'd throw a nickel and sometimes even a dime toward us, so we could go and buy candy. And we just thought that was the greatest. And speaking of that, I had a paper route when I probably was 10 years old, maybe 11, but I had a paper, 10 years, 9 or 10 really. And I was so lucky because it was for the Milwaukee Journal, Daily Milwaukee Journal. And the paper was fondly known as the green sheet because the top page of the paper was printed on green paper. And they gave, my route consisted of the train depot and the barracks where these sailors stayed. And how great was that? On the masthead of the paper, it clearly said 3 cents. And I was to keep 1 cent and give 2 cents to the Milwaukee Journal office. Well, when I went through the train while it was stopped, shouting, "Milwaukee green sheet paper, Milwaukee green sheet paper." How much, kid? 5 cents, please. So I always got 3 cents and gave the office 2 cents. Sometimes I'd get a dime for it, but I mean, I commonly charged a nickel because they were on the train, they didn't care, and they wanted the paper. And then after I finished walking through the 2 or 3 cars and it was getting ready to leave, I would walk about 2 blocks over to the Navy barracks. Same thing, I was allowed in the barracks, in all of the long room, big rooms with all the cots or bunks that the Navy guys stayed in. And same thing, I'd always get a nickel or a dime for my papers. So I didn't have a paper route that I had to go to the customers. They were all in one place. That was the greatest. And they would kind of take me in as one of their own. I ate with them in their mess hall, and of course the food was far, far better than we had at home, so I liked that. And they would even invite myself and my buddies to watch movies. They had the popular movies they showed there every night. And then if that wasn't great, well, which it was, but the best thing of all was they let me shop in their little ship store, they called it, where they could buy the things that we as civilians could not buy, and one of them was chocolate, Hershey bars. And I could buy Hershey bars there or anything else, but I concentrated pretty much on Hershey bars because they were 5 cents. And when I went to school, I could sell them for 10 or 15 cents. And if it were adults in my dad's shop, I sometimes even got a quarter for the candy bar. So I had a good side business going there. That was a wonderful time. And then later, well, no, I got ahead of myself. Actually, when we first got back and moved to Quay Street, that's where I got sidetracked because I was telling you about the Navy barracks and so on. But one of the neatest things was just to stroll downtown. And I'll just take you on a little quick tour. If you imagine the 8th Street Bridge, and then going south, that would be up toward where Lincoln High School is, in that direction. Let's just go on the west side of the street. The very first shop there was a great place. It was called Fannie Farmer Candy. And as I said before, this was a bustling community. They had 4 or 5 women's stores and 4 or 5 shoe stores and hat shops and what have you. But this first store was my favorite because it was the candy store. And of course, we only had pennies to spend, if that, once in a while. And so it was out of our price range. But as little Quay Street kids, we like to call ourselves, or they called us, we would go in, and these 2 or 3 nice old ladies always had in the corner of one of the cases a few pieces of candy that they sold us for a penny. So that was great. Next to that was a huge a drugstore. It was called Mears, M-U-I-R-S, Mears Drugstore. And in that drugstore, they sold everything a family ever needed. I mean, we, as kids, could go in there with our parents, and we wondered what some of the apparatuses and things were for, but it was a wondrous place. And they had a 1 cent sale most every day, or at least an ad once a week with that in. And this was a 1 cent sale. It wasn't a sale where you bought an item and then you got the second one for a penny. You could buy things for a penny. That's what their 1 cent sale was all about. Next to that was was called the Holly Shop, and that was the first of women's clothing stores. And there were only about 3 or 4 of us that lived on Quay Street. One little girl, Jeannie Bruins, was a little tomboy. She was our friend, and Lyman Lawrence, who lived above the Chinese Laundry, and another little guy, I can't remember, my brother and myself. So we were pretty well known by the merchants, but we would stand at the Holly shop and watch those beautiful mannequins being dressed. We thought that was just the coolest thing. That was fun, something. And the man in there would shake his fingers and tell us to move on. The next store was Hoyer Brothers Clothing, and I never knew anyone, my folks never knew anyone that shopped there because that was way out of our price range also. And anyway, they didn't have children's clothes, and even if they did, they could never compete with the church bazaar prices and the hand-me-downs that we were used to wearing. And after that was another great store. And the reason it was great, it was called the Big Shoe Store. And the reason it was so great is they had it's called fluoroscopic, but it's like an x-ray machine, and you stood on it and put your feet in the slots with the new shoes on, and you could actually see your toes and your bones and just how they fit in the shoes. And even though you might be complaining about it, the salesman also had a viewer that he looked through with a pointer, and he'd kind of point around your toes, and even if you were complaining, he'd say, no, you've got plenty of room, they fit just fine. And it was overwhelming. I mean, it was something that was fascinating. We never saw that anywhere else. And I don't know how any other shoe store could compete with them because of that great x-ray machine. The next store was Rumley's Jewelry, and that was interesting also because we, of course, and my parents or any of my relatives never shopped there, but they had fascinating window exhibits, little villages with moving people and animals, and we pressed our nose against that window, it seemed like, for hours and watched that. We just thought that was so great, and we often wondered who actually bought those beautiful necklaces and things that they had on display. The next store was Kinney's, K-I-N-N-E-Y-S, Kinney's shoe store. And of course, as I said before, as far as I was concerned, they weren't even on the same planet that the Big Shoe Store was on, so I don't think they were any competition. The next and last store in that block was a dry cleaner, and upstairs was a place called Dow, D-O-W, Dow's Canvas. And Tiny Dow, his wife, and one other lady would sew on these huge machines. They'd sew awnings, and I don't know why they called him Tiny. He weighed about 320 pounds, but that really was the beginning of the still existing Dow Canvas in the industrial park in Manitowoc. So let's just skip back to the bridge, but go on the other side of the street. And the first building there was the Elks Club, big, beautiful brick building. And we were allowed in there once in a great while to watch my folks bowl. They only had 4 bowling alleys in that building, and of course a bar and whatever else the Elks Club needed. And that was fun, but we liked the place right next to it, which was called Coney Island Cafe. And the smell of their hot dogs or wieners on one of these rotating rotisseries, and the juice bubbling out, and well, you could smell it the whole block. I mean, it was just great. And what a deal that was. A big, beautiful hot dog with relish and everything on it for 10 cents. And so that was, of course, as far as we were concerned, that's where we wanted to be. Next to that was a furrier, where furs were made, fur jackets and fur collars were made, and there was a sign that said fur storage, because there was no air conditioning or humidifiers or dehumidifiers in those days. So ladies that had furs had to store them in a certain temperature controlled place, and that's what they did. That was a big business. And next to that was a store that, well, it was not a store, it was the Western Union. And we pretty much avoided that because it was so ominous, and of course that's where people sent telegrams, but even worse than that was that's where they received telegrams about their loved ones in the war that were killed. And so we just knew not to hang around that store. Now I'm going to stay on the east side and quickly go through the next block, which was still part of our territory, and it had the huge J.J. Stangle's hardware store. It was 3 stories high. When you walked in the store front door, there was one stairway going down and one going up, and it had everything you could imagine, sporting goods and things for roofing and everything. But the men had long ladders that traveled on a track, and when you wanted something, often they had to climb up these ladders and get it off the shelf. Then next to that was the Howard Hotel and Cafe, and downstairs, it was kind of a funny thing. From the sidewalk, you could see downstairs into the pool room where people, young men, shot pool, and they served something called near beer, which I take it was because of prohibition or something, but it still had some alcohol in it, but it was not very strong. But I guess if you were tall enough to play pool, they served the beer to you, they didn't care. And then Mrs. Meeker's hat shop came next, and my mother worked there, and an aunt of mine lived upstairs. Many of these stores, in fact, most of them had living quarters upstairs, and they were rented out, or sometimes they were occupied by the owner of the store. But the next place was by far better than anything else. It was the bus station. And that was on the corner of Franklin and Washington Street, where of course the new library takes that whole block now, but that's where it was. And the reason the bus station was so great is because we would hang out there inside. They had big, long wooden benches that were almost like church pews, and a pot-bellied stove for heat. Because in the winter, in the late fall, it was slushy and messy outside, and people would wait inside for their buses. All the buses in the city arrived and left from that corner. But what? The reason, and they had a cigar shop in there and newspaper stand. But that's where we found pennies and nickels on the floor, in that messy, slushy floor that was wet and dirty. And that was the best place of all to find money. And then, of course, you'd see people that came from every part of the city, areas of the city we'd never been to. So it was like a big, I don't know, a tour of some sort for us to see all these people coming and going. And the buses continually ran. I don't know if they ran all night, but they ran late at night. And then across the street from that, going back to Quay Street, was Kresge's great candy counter inside, where we could spend our pennies once in a while. And then there was Paulus's Shoe Repair. It was a regular store with big windows, and you could watch these men with cigarettes in their mouth. It was all smoky in there, working on these shoes. There was rows and rows and rows and rows of shoes that were ready to be picked up or dropped off. And these men worked on these machines that were run with huge belts that traveled on pulleys. And it was fascinating to watch. And when I think about it, these were men that were proud of what they were doing. That was their profession. They fixed shoes, and they'd concentrate on it and get them all fixed up or sewn up, new heels, new soles, and then shine them up and put them on the shelf for people to pick up. So we spent lots and lots of time watching that. Next was the very first, I guess you'd call it supermarket, but not like we think of it today. It was a combination of the old-fashioned grocery store. It was a Kroger store, and you didn't have push carts, but you'd get a basket when you went in, and many things were available for self-service, but if you wanted meat or other eggs or whatever it was, that was still the old-fashioned way, where you told the man what you wanted, and he would get it for you and check you out. And that was right around the corner from my dad's shop, so I was in charge of taking a quarter and the big empty quart bottle every morning and going over there to, you brought the empty bottle, and then you paid for the milk and you got a glass bottle. But when I got there, more often than not, my fist was still clenched around that quarter, and I had the bottle, but I didn't have the quarter. And so I'd have to retrace my steps with all the zigzags and places that I crawled and whatever I did on the way over there. And finally, most of the time I'd find the quarter. I maybe didn't lose it every time, but I lost it often. I'm preoccupied. And then another hat store, and then it took a left there going back on Quay Street to the shop. And I spent several years there, certainly through the early part of the war until my dad went off to in the Navy for World War II. Two Rivers came back into my life as I was old enough to actually ride my bike from Manitowoc to Two Rivers to visit my grandparents. And I'll tell you, the downtown there too was bustling with stores and restaurants, and I wasn't too familiar with it, but I know that there was a lot of, and Schrader's of course was there even in those days, as was Settinger Hardware, which now is on the side street, but they at one point were on the main street. The Central Park was there, and there was the trolley ran from Manitowoc to Two Rivers. And when my mom, before she was married, she went to Holy Family Nursing School, and every day she'd take that trolley and it took her all the way to downtown Manitowoc, and she'd walk to the hospital, go to school, and then come back. It was 10 cents, the ride was 10 cents, and it must have been a beautiful ride along Lake Michigan. The tracks are still there. They're behind some houses and stores, but that was a common thing to see the trolley. The other thing that I remember was the huge parades and picnics that were held by the Aluminum Goods Manufacturing Company at Hamilton's. Those places actually had their own bands. They had just like you had the Two Rivers Municipal Band, they would have the Aluminum Goods Band and the Hamilton Band. And people were very patriotic and very much involved in those things because they weren't exposed to much. I mean, when you lived in Two Rivers, that was pretty much your world, especially in the days during and after the Depression. I mean, it was very, by today's standards, very poor and very plain and simple. But you know, that's when families enjoyed getting together and playing cards and things like that. And the kids were always kind of left by themselves. You didn't have to worry about, as 6 and 8 year olds, we walked from my grandma's house downtown, so to speak, maybe got an ice cream cone or something, maybe, but walked around and just kind of watched the people and watched what was going on. And you didn't have to worry about your children being abducted or none of these things even entered anyone's mind at that time. So that's the early days, and I went to school in Manitowoc and graduated at Lincoln High School in 1950, the class of 1950. We just celebrated our 60th reunion, and then started my business operations and so on in Manitowoc. And later on, after I founded a company called Yogi Bear's Jellystone Park Campground, which we started actually in Two Rivers. Don Olson, the attorney in town, and Bob Borkovitz, who was a builder, and myself, I took them in as partners, and we built our first park in Door County, and then we franchised parks from that throughout the country until we had an excess of over 100 campgrounds, Jellystone Park campgrounds. So when we built the park in Door County, I moved my family up there and lived up there until I retired and moved to Florida. And now I come back to Two Rivers where my heart really is and spend probably 6 or 8 months here. And I still love Two Rivers. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful town, and I hope and pray that we will get some kinds of businesses going here that will help us through this slump. I think that's about it. And I mean, there's a lot of incidents that happen, but as far as the old days, it was a simple, wonderful life, and